The rain hammered against the cracked window of the abandoned warehouse in Baltimore's industrial district. Inside, a woman sat hunched over in the corner, her hands bound behind her back with zip ties that cut into her wrists. Her name was Sarah Chen, though the three men who had brought her here didn't care to know it. They called her the Asset, or simply her. She had been there for 6 days. Sarah was 42 years old, a former Navy intelligence officer turned cybersecurity consultant. Her dark hair hung limp around her face, and her clothes were torn and dirty from the struggle that had ended with her being thrown into the trunk of a black sedan nearly a week ago. But it wasn't fear that dominated her thoughts now. It was calculation. She had been trained for situations like this, and though she never imagined she would actually face one in civilian life. The men who held her were professionals. That much was clear from the beginning. They weren't common criminals looking for ransom money. They were operatives, likely working for someone with serious resources. Sarah had been investigating a case involving stolen military technology, following digital breadcrumbs that led to a network of international arms dealers. She had gotten too close to something big, and now she was paying the price. Through the dirty window, she could see the sun setting over the harbor. Another day was ending, and she was no closer to freedom. The three men took turns watching her, rotating shifts every 8 hours like clockwork. They barely spoke to each other and never to her except to bark orders. She had tried talking to them at first, and explaining that she was just a consultant, that she didn't know anything important. They hadn't believed her. She hadn't expected them to. The leader of the group was a man they called Kozlov. He was Russian, she thought, based on his accent during the few times he had spoken. He was tall and lean with cold gray eyes that seemed to look through her rather than at her. He wore expensive suits even in this filthy place, and he checked his phone constantly, as if waiting for orders from someone higher up the chain. The other two were muscle. One was a thick-necked American with a crew cut who looked like he had spent time in the military. He chewed gum constantly and cleaned his pistol every night with the kind of care that suggested he knew how to use it. The other was younger, maybe 30, with dark hair and nervous energy. And he was the one who brought her food, sliding paper plates of cold, fast food across the concrete floor twice a day. He never made eye contact. Sarah knew she was in serious trouble. The initial panic had faded after the first day, replaced by a cold clarity that came from years of training. She assessed her situation methodically, looking for weaknesses, opportunities, anything she could use. The warehouse was large and mostly empty, with rusted equipment and old crates scattered around. There were 2 doors, one leading to what looked like an office area, the other to the outside. Both were always locked when no one was coming or going. Her captors had made one mistake, though she wasn't sure if it was really a mistake or if they simply didn't care. When they had first captured her, they had searched her roughly, taking her phone, but her wallet and her bag. But they had been looking for weapons and communication devices. They hadn't noticed the tattoo on her left shoulder blade, hidden beneath her torn shirt. It was small, just 2 inches across, but it meant everything. It was a naval intelligence insignia, earned during a classified operation 12 years ago. Only a handful of people would recognize it, and even fewer would understand what it represented. The operation had been designated Grey Falcon, and it had involved deep cover work in Eastern Europe. Sarah had been part of a small team tracking weapons smugglers connected to extremist groups. The mission had lasted 18 months and had been both dangerous and successful. At the end, the 5 team members who had survived had been given the option to receive a special commendation. Sarah and 2 others had chosen instead to get matching tattoos, a private acknowledgement of what they had been through together. It seemed important at the time, a way to remember without official records that could be compromised. Now, sitting in this warehouse with her wrists bound and her future uncertain, Sarah wondered if anyone was even looking for her. She had been freelancing, working remotely most of the time. She lived alone in a small apartment in Arlington. Her parents were retired in Florida, and she didn't have siblings. There were colleagues who might notice her absence eventually, but she had taken cases that kept her offline for days at a time before. How long would it take before someone realized something was wrong? On the seventh morning, things changed. Sarah woke to the sound of raised voices near the office. Kozlov was on his phone speaking rapidly in Russian. His tone was different now, urgent and angry. The two other men stood nearby, looking tense. Something had gone wrong with their plan, whatever it was. Sarah's heart rate increased. In her experience, when criminals got nervous, captives became more expendable. She watched as Kozlov ended his call and turned to the others. They spoke in low voices for several minutes, occasionally glancing in her direction. Then Kozlov made another call, this one shorter. When he hung up, he looked directly at Sarah for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said something to the crew-cut American, who nodded and left through the outside door. The waiting was worse than anything else. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Were they going to move her? Kill her? But had someone paid a ransom she didn't know about? The younger guard brought her water in a plastic bottle, setting it down within reach. For the first time, he looked at her directly. There was something in his eyes that looked almost like pity, and that terrified her more than the gun on his hip. 2 hours passed, then 3. The afternoon sun slanted through the dirty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Sarah's shoulders ached from being in the same position for so long, and her wrists were raw where the zip ties had rubbed them. She forced herself to stay alert, to keep watching for any opportunity. Her training had taught her that giving up hope was the first step toward not surviving. When the outside door finally opened again, it wasn't the crew-cut American who entered. It was a new group. The 4 men in dark suits who moved with military precision. Kozlov stood up immediately, and there was a brief exchange that Sarah couldn't hear clearly. One of the new arrivals was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone used to command. He looked around the warehouse with obvious distaste. Then his eyes found Sarah. He walked toward her slowly, studying her face. Sarah met his gaze steadily, refusing to show fear. The man stopped a few feet away and said something to Kozlov in Russian. Kozlov responded, gesturing toward Sarah with one hand. The silver-haired man frowned, then moved closer. He walked around her, examining her from different angles like she was a piece of merchandise. Then he paused behind her, and Sarah felt his fingers brush against the back of her shoulder, near where her tattoo was hidden beneath her torn shirt. There was a sharp intake of breath. The man barked something at Kozlov, his tone changing completely. Kozlov looked confused and started to respond, but the silver-haired man cut him off with a sharp gesture. He called to one of his associates, who quickly crossed the floor and began examining Sarah's shoulder more carefully. He pulled the fabric of her shirt aside, revealing the small tattoo. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The silver-haired man's face went white, then red. He began shouting at Kozlov in a mixture of Russian and English, his voice rising with each word. Sarah couldn't follow everything, but she caught enough. The tattoo had been recognized. Someone knew what it meant. The silver-haired man was demanding to know how they could have been so stupid. So careless. Did they have any idea who they were holding? Kozlov looked genuinely shocked, which told Sarah he really hadn't known. He stammered something about checking databases, about her civilian identity. The silver-haired man wasn't interested in excuses. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking rapidly. Sarah's mind was racing. Who was this man? How did he know about Gray Falcon? The operation had been deeply classified. Only people at the highest levels of military intelligence should have that information. The call lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the silver-haired man looked at Sarah with an expression that was hard to read. There was anger there, but also something else. Worry, perhaps, or fear. He said something to his associates, and 2 of them immediately moved to Sarah's side. One of them pulled out a knife, and for a terrible moment, Sarah thought this was the end. But instead of using it on her, he cut the zip ties binding her wrists. The relief was immediate and intense. Sarah gasped as blood flow returned to her hands, bringing with it a painful tingling sensation. She rubbed her wrists gingerly, not quite believing what was happening. The silver-haired man spoke to her directly for the first time, his English accented but clear. "You will come with us," he said. It wasn't quite an order, but it wasn't a request either. Sarah looked from him to Kozlov, who stood frozen with an expression of dawning horror on his face. Whatever was happening, Kozlov had just realized how badly he had miscalculated. The silver-haired man snapped his fingers, and his associates helped Sarah to her feet. Her legs were weak from days of inactivity, and she had to be supported as they walked toward the door. As they passed Kozlov, the silver-haired man stopped and said something in Russian. His tone was cold and final. Kozlov's face went pale. They continued walking, leaving the 3 original captors standing in the warehouse, looking like men who had just realized they were standing on a cliff edge. Outside, the fresh air hit Sarah like a physical blow. After 6 days in the stale atmosphere of the warehouse, even the polluted air of Baltimore's industrial district tasted sweet. There was a black SUV waiting, engine running. The silver-haired man opened the back door himself and gestured for Sarah to get in. She hesitated, looking at his face, trying to understand what was happening. "You are not a prisoner anymore," he said, seeming to read her thoughts. "But we must talk. There are complications." Sarah climbed into the SUV, her mind full of questions. As they pulled away from the warehouse, she looked back and saw Kozlov and his men standing in the doorway, watching them leave. She had no idea what would happen to them, and in that moment she didn't care. She was free. But as the vehicle merged into traffic and headed toward downtown Baltimore, Sarah realized that her ordeal might not be over. The tattoo that had saved her life had also revealed her true identity. And if the wrong people learned about it, she might have simply traded one prison for another. The SUV drove in silence for 20 minutes before turning into an underground parking garage beneath a nondescript office building. The silver-haired man hadn't spoken during the drive, and his associates maintained a professional silence. Sarah's training told her to stay alert, to memorize the route, to prepare for whatever came next. But exhaustion was finally catching up with her, and she felt the adrenaline that had sustained her for 6 days beginning to fade. They took an elevator to the 15th floor, emerging into a corridor that looked like any corporate office space. But Sarah noticed the security cameras, the reinforced doors, and the subtle signs of hardened construction. This wasn't a normal office. They entered a conference room with a large window overlooking the city. The silver-haired man gestured for her to sit, then dismissed his associates with a nod. When they were alone, he sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table. "My name is Viktor Petrov," he said. was a senior officer in Russian military intelligence. I have been retired for 8 years, but I maintain certain connections. When I received word that someone matching your description was being held by Kozlov's group, I did not think much of it. They are criminals, smugglers, nothing more. But then I was told about the tattoo." Sarah said nothing, waiting. Petrov continued.